Welcome back to Z-Speed, and thanks for tuning back in. Today we're going to take this 350Z differential that I picked up from a local junkyard. We're going to refurbish it and turn it into something just like this. So if you're interested in learning how to do that, just stay tuned. So you're probably wondering why I wanted to take a junkyard diff, refurbish it, and place it in my 350Z. You're probably wondering, hey, what's wrong with your current differential? And the short answer is there's nothing at all wrong with my current differential, but it is what's left over from my automatic to manual transmission swap. So this is a automatic differential versus a manual differential with a shorter gear ratio of 3.35, 7 to 1 versus 3.538 to 1. So since I swapped my transmission out, I now want to swap out my differential, and it'll basically just give me a better gas mileage as far as freeway travel goes, because we're going from a 3.3 to a 3.5. So when I'm in 6th gear, I'll definitely lower my RPMs a little bit and get a little better gas mileage. So if you haven't seen that video, I'll link it down below. But this is the transmission I swapped in, and it's the latest version of this CD009 transmission. And now we're going to upgrade to a differential that fits a manual transmission here. So most of the differentials out there for manual, except for the base, are limited slip differentials. So I kind of gambled when I picked this one up. I didn't really know if it was a base model or not, but for 90 bucks, I couldn't really beat the deal. So I just went ahead and grabbed it just in case it was a limited slip diff, hoping it was, versus an open diff, but I'll take either one just to get the proper gear ratio. So the first thing we're going to do to get started is to remove the speed sensors, and they're just held on by two 12mm bolts, and mine are looking a little rusty here, but there it is right there. So remove that one and this one, and these speed sensors just slide right out. I'm probably going to use my original speed sensors. I don't think it really matters, but I could reuse these if I needed to. Next, let's talk about safety equipment. You will need a respirator and eye protection, or at least an N95, so you don't breathe in all these particles from all the sanding we're going to be doing. I'm going to use a bunch of different wire wheels, some steel wool. You could definitely use a Dremel too to get in some of the smaller nooks and crannies on the outside of this differential. There's quite a few little nooks and crannies. I didn't actually use a Dremel, but I had one. I should have broke it out, but I didn't. But I was able to get it done with just these wire wheels, and I didn't even really use the sanding discs either. So just some wire wheels and some steel wool should be more than enough, and some lung and eye protection. Also, before we get started, you want to preserve this little mark on the flange on the front of the diff. It could be either yellow or white. On my other diff, it's white, but this little mark is supposed to line up with a little white or yellow mark on your carbon fiber drive shaft, and you're supposed to line those two up when you bolt these things together. So make sure you preserve that mark. You don't want to sand that off and lose your reference point here. So now we're ready to get started. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and now break those two 12mm bolts loose that hold the two speed sensors in, like we talked about earlier. And mine were a little crusty, but they broke loose pretty easily here, so that was no big deal. Just remove those two bolts, and then you're going to gently slide those two speed sensors out. I didn't have any issues breaking those speed sensors loose. Just kind of wiggle them side to side, and they should come on out here for you. And if you want to reuse those, you can hit those with a little 303 aerospace protectant and shine them up just like new. So now that those are out of the way, we can go ahead and tape off the vent tube on top of the diff. This one's bent up here, but we still want to tape that off. We don't want any dust or debris getting inside the differential while we're doing all of our sanding out here. So now I've decided to go ahead and start working on the flange on the front of the diff first. And I wanted to go a little gently with some steel wool. I thought that might be easier way to work on the flange area. I didn't really want to get too aggressive, but I very quickly realized that this rust was a little hardcore here. It was a little worse than I thought, and steel wool was really not making much of a difference. As a matter of fact, it wasn't really doing anything at all. So I decided to hold up on the steel wool, and now I think we're just going to go with the wire wheel. First thing I noticed as far as the wire wheels go is that this deeper style of wire wheel is great for getting into this flange that hooks to the rear hub assemblies. You can get down in there and get all that rust out. So it wasn't as good on the actual outer part of the differential, but it was really good for getting inside this area and getting the rust out. So you might want to use one of these type of wire wheels when sanding out the flanges that hook up to the rear hub assemblies. And then after that, basically it's just going to take time to go around the entire outside of the differential. You're going to want to use different style wheels to get in more of the nooks and crannies, and eventually you're going to get this thing rust free or pretty close to it. And then at this point, I've now found a great place to use the steel wool, and that is on these little aluminum rings on the inside of this flange. You can see these little raised bars. That is where the speed sensors can tell how fast that the hub is spinning. So you want to be gentle with those. Steel wool, maybe wire brushes on that, but you don't want to really get too crazy and damage these rings, because that's how the sensors are reading the hubs spinning. So now at this point, we're just basically going to go over the entire outside, take our time, and try to get this thing as clean as possible so we can prep it for paint. So now that we're done sanding, it's time to get all of the debris off of the outer casing. So you're going to need a few bottles of brake cleaner here. Pick up at least 3 to make sure that we have enough. And what you're going to do is basically spray down every square inch that we sanded, and even parts that you didn't sand. We just want to make sure that you get every bit of the debris off of the outer casing here, and make sure that there's no residue at all left. Once you get that pretty well sprayed off, then you're going to need a lint-free towel to go in here and dry everything off. Once again, with the lint-free towel, we'll be going over pretty much every square inch of the outer casing here and any of the small little working parts to make sure that we've got all of the brake cleaner off and any debris that we might have missed. So once we get this thing all dried off, we're going to go ahead and tape off a couple of areas. I'm going to show you how to do that next. But by the time we're done taping off these areas, this thing should be dry enough for paint. Okay, first thing you don't want to paint is the little ring around the hub assembly flange that allows the speed sensor to determine how fast the hubs are spinning. You don't want to paint that for sure. So what I'm doing now is just taking a little ribbon of masking tape all the way around, and just going to do one little loop around that, and then I'm going to grab a razor blade and cut the excess off. So once again, I'm just going to spin the hub assembly and cut as I go, so it comes out with a nice thin little piece of tape covering only the speed sensor area. So We can paint the rest of the hub flange, but we don't want to paint that. So it comes out pretty nice with the razor blade. Okay, second thing you don't want to paint is the flange that mates to the carbon fiber drive shaft. So you want to go ahead and mask and tape that off as well. And then once you get that covered, you can go ahead and take a razor blade and just spin this thing and cut the excess mask and tape off once again. So it's very easy to do and a quick and easy job. So once you get that covered, then we've only got one area left that we want to cover up. Okay, the last thing you want to tape up is the outside of the flange that attaches to the hub assembly. You can see I did it just like I covered the flange that attaches to the drive shaft. I just put tape around the outside and then cut around the edges with the razor blade, and we're all set. So if you're wondering what kind of paint I'm going to use, I like the VHT, and we're going to need something that can handle a lot of heat. So this is the high heat paint for roll bars and chassis here. This thing's rated at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and we all know that these diffs can get really hot, especially if you're on the track beating it up a little bit, or if you're doing quite a few pulls on the street. This thing is going to get pretty doggone hot, so you want to make sure you have some paint that can handle this and it's not going to bubble up and peel off. So make sure that you give a really good first coat on this thing. You want to hit all the surfaces really well. And if you're wondering why I'm not worried about the diff cover and I'm spraying over the edges of it, is because I'm not worried about that diff cover. We're going to be swapping that out with the Z1 Motorsport diff cover. So that's why I'm hitting that and letting overspray get all over that. So basically you just want to make sure that you cover everything with this first coat and get a good solid coat all the way around this thing. We're going to let that dry for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we're going to come in for a second coat after that. You want to have at least 2 coats of high temp paint on this differential because it gets so hot. It could cause the paint to bubble if you don't give it a good 2 solid coats. Okay, I let the paint cure for about 2 to 3 days. You want to give it at least 24 hours to cure, and it came out really nice here. So you just want to make sure it's in a low humidity area. If it's the middle of summer, if it's winter, it doesn't matter. But you can see we've got a beautiful finish, and these serial numbers, I believe they're standard for 0506 manual diff. So you can look those numbers up. But yeah, this paint came out really nice. So I'm pretty happy. Make sure that you don't disturb it for at least, like I said, 24 hours. You want it to dry and harden really well. And I didn't talk about this flange here earlier, but there's a couple different flanges. I think the G35 has a triangular 3-bolt flange. So you want to make sure that when you buy a diff or purchase a diff from somebody, that flange matches your drive shaft. I didn't really talk about that earlier, but you want it to be the exact same as the current diff that you're running. So now it's time to go ahead and drain this diff. I'm going to use a number 10 hex screw or hex bolt socket to break this loose. I'm going to start with the fill plug and then hit the drain plug, and we're going to get all this old oil out of here. Now there's quite a bit of torque on the fill and drain plug here, so you might need a breaker bar. That's what I decided to use because I had a little issue breaking it loose at first, and the breaker bar made short work of it here. So I just loosened the fill port to allow some air in, and now we're going to break loose the drain port. So what we're hoping to find here is, number one, we're hoping to find some diff fluid, and hopefully it's not dry. And we're also hoping to find no chunks or anything weird coming out of here. So if you remember, I got this thing from my local junkyard called Stennett's out here in the Tuscaloosa area. And when I found this 350Z, it was pretty much gutted. There wasn't much left to begin with. It had been cut up and everything was stripped out. One thing I found was the drive shaft. It was a little rusty too, laying right here on the front where the engine used to be, and luckily I found this diff. Now this diff is inverted, so I knew I probably had lost some diff fluid through the little vent tube on the other side, but I was hoping that it was still in decent shape, so I kind of gambled, like I said earlier. Wasn't sure if it was usable or not, but the price was pretty good, so I went ahead and grabbed it up. And this is also where I got my pedals. So here we go. We're gonna start draining here, and first thing I noticed, I don't know if you just saw that, but something big kaplunked out, and at first I was like, oh no, it's part of the ring gear or something, some big chunk of metal. But I kept waiting for more pieces to come out, and luckily nothing else did come out. And then so I started thinking about it. I was like, well, hold on, maybe that was a lock washer or something. So sure enough, I decided to go ahead and fish it out, and yes, I was right. Luckily, it was not a chunk of metal, it was just the washer, so we're safe here. On the downside, there wasn't a whole lot of diff fluid in there, but there was a decent amount. It looks like it had never been changed, and the good news is the magnet on the drain plug looked pretty decent. You are expecting to see a slight little film, but you don't want to see any little metal chunks or bits, and I didn't see anything like that, so I was pretty happy and hoping for the best here. So far so good. The main problem is we didn't have a lot of differential fluid in it, which we kind of expected, but the drain plug looks really good. No small chunks or anything like that, just your usual slight film. So we're going to go ahead and clean this little plug off, and we're going to finish letting the diff fluid drain out, and then we're going to go ahead and put our plugs back in. And now we're going to, next up, before we take off the diff cover, we're going to remove the two front bushings from the differential. Okay, before we get started, things you're going to need: at least 2 4x4s or some chunks of wood that you can brace this thing with. I would put the diff on the ground or the grass because you want a little give, not cement. You're definitely going to need PB blaster or liquid wrench, and a minimum of 2.5 pound sledgehammer or a 5 pound sledgehammer. A rubber mallet is not going to do it. You need a metal sledge to do this, and a socket that fits just inside that little ring hole there. So nothing that matches the same size. It's got to be a little bit smaller. Something that'll fit right through that hole. So whatever socket you want to use, I used a 17/16, I believe, but don't quote me on that one. Okay, let me show you a better example of what type of socket should fit in here. You want something that's just a little bit loose like this one. I'm going to show you one that's too small. That's way too small. And this one is too large. It actually starts to bind on the inside of the collar. So I've already sprayed it all down with PB blaster and let it soak for a good 30 minutes. You've got metal sleeve on a metal sleeve here, and so we're trying to get that to break loose, and we have to let that stuff saturate through. Now this looks way too easy, and I worked on this one a little bit before I filmed it, so that's why I just came out with a couple whacks. I'm going to show you one from start to finish in a minute, but yeah, you see this is internal sleeve is metal, and then you've got that metal casing where the diff is, and so it's metal on metal, so that's why it's kind of hard to knock out. I've seen guys use torches and then burn it and then knock it out that way, or cut it out. You really don't have to if you use this technique. Just make sure that the differential is inverted. This is upside down. We're going to be knocking from the bottom towards the top, so it's not going to work if you have the diff right side up. It's got to be upside down to knock these things out, so don't forget that part. That's the crucial part. And now we're going to go ahead and start on the other side, and you can see I've repositioned the blocks of wood here, so I've got something to stabilize it on the left side, and then we're going to knock the right side out. So now we're going to go ahead and show it from start to finish. Of course, I've already hit with PB blaster and let it soak for about 30 minutes. And now we're going to go ahead and make sure you're wearing eye protection now, and we're going to start smacking it out. So just nice level whacks. Don't miss it. If you start to get too high up, you lift your hammer too high, you might miss it and hit the diff. You don't want to do that. You just want to concentrate just on the socket. So you can see it's starting to move a little bit now. And slowly but surely, this thing is working its way out, and bingo, right there, it popped out. So it wasn't really that hard. You know, a lot of people say that it's really hard to remove these, but if you use this technique, it should make it a much easier job for you. Okay, now we can finally remove the diff cover bolts, and I would recommend a breaker bar here. I just had a 3/8 inch ratchet, and it was a little too short. I ended up using a rubber mallet to help me break it loose, but the main problem is this thing, you know, has been laying out in the junkyard, getting sun-baked and rained on. And what happened was, I realized after I took the second bolt out, was that there was a bit of oxidation. The bolts had started to oxidize inside this diff, so that's what was making it so hard to break loose. So you might want a breaker bar here, but you can see once I pull the bolt out that there's quite a bit of oxidation on there, and that's what's making it so hard to pull these bolts out. I've got brand new bolts for my diff cover, so I'm cool there. I'm just going to throw these bolts out. Okay, now it's time to remove the diff cover, and all it takes is a little flathead screwdriver, and here's the pry point right here. You stick your flathead in there and it popped right out. So right in here, and there's one on the opposite bottom corner there on the right hand side at the bottom, same type of pry point. So yeah, that came off pretty easily. You can see we've got a little bit of varnishing inside the cover, nothing major, so not bad at all. So now what we want to do is inspect the pinion gear, and that's the main gear in the very center right there. I'm going to spin the hub axles and just check the gear, make sure there's no missing teeth. You want anything catastrophic like, you know, broken off teeth or a bunch of debris, and I don't see any debris, and all the teeth are there, and they actually look like they're in really good shape. So we're gonna go ahead and drain some more of this diff fluid out by tilting the whole thing, and look for any debris at the very bottom of the diff here. But I don't see anything unusual here. I mean, the oil's pretty set, clapped out and sad. It's, you know, never probably been changed, but other than that, this diff looks like it's in pretty good shape. It's definitely a VLSD, not an open diff, and that's what we wanted. You see when I'm spinning the hub that they both spin, and that's the sign that you have a VLSD. If you can put your hands on both hubs and spin them in opposite directions, that's going to be an open diff, and that's the less desirable differential. So this is luckily a VLSD, so we're good to go here. So now it's time to remove the leftover gasket maker from the edge here so we can mate up our new diff cover, and just go nice and slow. You don't want to scratch the surface. You can see I'm using a putty knife to get all the big debris off. And once I get all the big stuff off, I'm going to come back with a razor and do the fine tuning to make sure that we get every little bit off. So you can see there's a little bit left after I scrape it with the putty knife. So that's why I'm going to use the razor and just come in here and just get every little bit. Once you get all this stuff off, we're going to go ahead and clean that surface with some brake cleaner. And then we can also clean the inside of the diff out and make sure that we don't see anything in the bottom of the diff. But we want to go ahead and get all the inside of the diff cleaned out as well. So let's go ahead and finish scraping this gasket off, and then we can go ahead and spray out the inside of the diff. So to clean the inside of this diff out, it's probably going to take at least 2 to 3 cans of brake cleaner if you want it to look really, really nice. So make sure you have that on hand. And basically the first thing I'm going to do is just go through and just spin the gear and just hit every, you know, square inch of the inside. And once you're pretty satisfied with that you've got most of the surface oil off, then we can go ahead and grab a lint-free cloth, and we're going to go ahead and start actually using a little elbow grease to scrub the pinion gear and the VLSD area. And so just going to hand clean it after we spray most of the surface oil off, and we can get this thing looking really nice if we just add a little elbow grease in here with the brake cleaner. So, take your time, get it as clean as you want it. It doesn't have to be spotless, obviously, but I decided to go ahead and get as much of this old debris and oil off of the pinion gear and the VLSD area right here as I could possibly get. So I took my time and got this thing looking pretty good. So, you spend as much time as you want on this part, but make sure that you get at least all the surface oil off of this pinion gear and out of the bottom of the differential casing. Okay, so I let this thing dry overnight to make sure all the residue was off of it, and I kind of gave it a final wipe, and it's looking really good here. You can see it looks quite nice. My cat even likes it. He's hanging out by it, but it looks like we're going to be okay. I inspected the pinion gear, and there was no irregular wear on the teeth or anything, so that looks good. And the VLSD portion looks okay, so I don't see anything major wrong with this thing. This should work well for us. All we have to do now is put on the new diff cover and fill it back up with some oil and gear oil, and we should be good to go here. So let's get started on that. So all these parts came from Z1 Motorsports. They didn't sponsor me for this one, but these guys have all the best parts. So I got a high capacity diff cover, and it increases the capacity by half a liter. So we end up using 2.25 quarts of 7590 Redline differential fluid, and that's definitely going to keep this rear end a lot cooler. I also got some polyurethane bushings and some new bolts for the diff cover. We're going to reuse these two plugs right here, but we got one extra one with the diff cover because we now have two little holes on the side of the diff cover. One is the fill port right here, and then this one is to monitor heat temps inside the diff cover if you have that ability. We also got a new vent tube we're going to place in, and some ultra gray Permatex for sealing the diff cover onto the differential. And I also picked up this bushing removal tool for the subframe. This thing's about 140 bucks. It's a little pricey, but I think it's well worth it because I really don't want to have to get in there and cut anything out. It's pretty difficult to get this bushing out of the subframe, and this tool makes it a lot easier. If you have an impact gun, you can zip that thing out pretty easily. So if you want to spend the money, this will make your life a lot easier. I'm going to use some 91% rubbing alcohol to clean the mating surface of the diff cover right here, and you could use brake cleaner or carburetor cleaner if you want. I'm just going to try the rubbing alcohol. It leaves no residue. I'm also going to get the inside of the diff cover and the mating surface on here as well. So I'm going to get that all cleaned up, but before we do that, we need to put this vent tube that we're going to be placing into the diff cover in the freezer. That's right, I said in the freezer because Z1 Motorsports recommends that you freeze this before placing it into or tapping it into the diff cover. It's kind of hard to get this thing to fit in there. It's a real tight fit, and by freezing the metal, it kind of shrinks it just ever so much, and we can get it in a little bit easier. So I'm going to sit it here by my turkey, and we're going to let these two chill out here. So now we can go ahead and get ready to clean the surfaces. Once you get the surfaces cleaned up, we're ready to open up the Permatex. You just want to perf the end here, and then we're going to stick our little application nozzle on. And so the application nozzle is the one that's a little tricky because you want to cut it to get just the perfect size bead. You don't want one that's too small and tiny, and you sure don't want one that's way too much. So You want the perfect amount, and it's hard to say which is exactly perfect. So I start off thinking that this would be a good spot, and then I quickly realize, no way, I'm gonna have to keep cutting here. I ended up adjusting that cut for about two or three times. That's still too small. You want a nice thick bead. You don't want a gigantic bead, but you want a nice thick one. So you may have to adjust it a little bit on the fly. Once you start to squeeze it out, you may realize you need to go bigger. So speaking of bigger, this is probably the bare minimum size bead that you want to go. I would probably go a little bit bigger. Looking at this now on video, I would think I might want to go just a little bit thicker than this. But when it comes to gasket maker, a little bit extra is not going to be near as bad is not enough. So if you think you're not getting enough on there, go a little heavier, because last thing you want to do is have to come back and reseal this thing. I did not have any leaks, so that's the good news with this size bead, but I'm looking at this now and going, I could definitely go a little wider on this. So try to keep a nice consistent bead as you make your way around the surface here. And this is my final product right here. Like I said, there probably could have went a little bit thicker, but this is definitely worked. I didn't end up with any leaks, so this is good. So now we're gonna go ahead and place the diff cover on. I've also placed both the bolts on the very top of the diff cover. You can barely make them out there. And now I'm gonna go ahead and mate this up to the differential. And you can see I got these bolts in here, and now I'm just going to hold it with one hand and hand thread these two top bolts in. Once you get these two on the top hand threaded in, we're going to go around and hand thread the rest of the bolts in and begin the torque down sequence here. All right, now that all the bolts are hand tightened, we're gonna go ahead and use an X pattern when we torque these to spec. So this bolt, these two bolts together, and these two bolts together, and these two bolts. 32 foot-pounds per the manual that Z1 Motorsports sends you with this diff cover. So if you don't remember all these steps, don't worry. They're all in the little printable manual that you can print out online. If you forget any of this stuff that's going on. But this is pretty much the sequence, so I'm just going around and tightening each bolt to 32 foot-pounds, and you're going to see some of the gasket maker ooze out. Don't worry about that. You can let it ooze out, and then once it's dried, you can shave it off with a razor if you wish. Okay, now what I consider the hardest part is placing the vent tube into the diff cover without destroying the diff cover or the vent tube. You're gonna need a ball peen, small ball peen, and a center punch with a flat tip. If you've got one, that's gonna be a lot better than a rounded tip. So I got a flat tipped center punch, and we're just basically gonna tap this thing in there. So at this point, I went to the freezer to grab the vent tube out of the freezer. Remember, we had it in there chilling. You can see it's nice and frosty. And the first thing I'm gonna try to do here is just tap the vent tube in to semi-seat it in the direction I want it to be placed in. So I thought I could just lightly tap it in, it would stay stable, and no, it did not want to do that. So at this point, I went ahead and grabbed my center punch and decided to see if I could start to seat it that way. It was definitely not going in very easy at all. I started tapping it in, and then I wanted to switch sides and tap a little on one side, tap a little on the other side to keep equal force on this thing. There's not a lot of room to play with here. We're in a very small little area, and I was just really having a hard time getting this thing to seat it all. So don't give up. It probably took me about 10 or 15 minutes to get this thing to finally seat. Eventually it started to grab, and once it did, then I started rotating my center punch around all sides of this vent tube to get a nice equal tap in. You don't want to tap it in too much on one side. You want to kind of go all the way around as you tap. The main takeaway here is not to get too aggressive because it's kind of hard to do this, and you might start hitting it really hard. You don't want to take that center punch and punch a hole right through your diff cover. It'll be easy to do, so that's, I think, the most dangerous thing is to not punch a hole in your diff cover while you're placing this vent tube into the diff cover itself. Okay, now it's time to place the mounting stud into the diff cover, and you've got two sets of threads here. You've got a smaller set and a larger set. So the larger set is going to be going into the diff cover here, and we're going to be using the provided red Loctite, and we're going to use quite a bit of Loctite on here, and because we're only going to be able to hand thread this thing in, we're not going to be able to actually torque it with any type of tool, so we're just going to spin it in with our hands and spin it all the way in as far as it'll go. And you want a lot of Loctite on there to make sure it's stuck in there and it's nice and stable. So once you get all your Loctite on there, now we're just going to go ahead and hand spin this thing all the way in as far as it'll go. And you know, it will come all the way down to that little ring, so just keep going till it bottoms out on that little centerpiece, that little ring that's between the two different sized threads. And once you get it in there as far as it'll go, then we can go ahead and wipe up the excess Loctite, and you're all set. So now you've got your mounting stud that goes into the subframe. Okay, now it's time to replace the fill plug, the drain plug, and that little plug up top that Z1 Motorsport sent us. Make sure that you use a brand new washer. They're provided with the diff cover. You want brand new washers for everything. And we're gonna basically torque down the drain plug, of course, and that upper plug that monitors the heat on the Z1 Motorsport diff cover, but we're not going to torque the fill port down yet because we're gonna be adding some diff fluid. Now that one up top that C1 Motorsport sent us is not the same size as the original fill and drain plug, so you're going to need a different size hex bolt socket for that one. But we're going to go ahead and torque this lower bolt down first to 25 foot-pounds, and I had a little issue getting some good leverage on there, so you know, you may have to grab the hub flange here to get it to torque down correctly, but it wasn't that bad. And now the easier one to do is this one on top. Okay, now we need to finally put the two silicone bushings into the differential, and this is very easy to do, so it's nothing real hard or technical here at all. Only thing you will need is some silicone spray or some WD-40. I like silicone spray because it doesn't break down a polyurethane or rubber products, and these are made of polyurethane, so I want to use some silicone spray, but just use whatever you have available. And this is pretty easy to do. So there's two sides to these polyurethane bushings. One has a recessed side and one does not. So this is the recessed side where the metal washer fits into this, and that's going to be on the bottom of the differential, and this non-recessed side will be on the top part of the differential. So we're going to go ahead and place the bottom part in first, and you don't have to put this washer on the bottom. I just grabbed it, thought I might need to, but I didn't. So we're gonna go ahead and just spray it down with a little bit of silicone spray, and we're gonna just push straight up and it slides right in. It was really easy to do. If you have a problem, you could tap it in with a mallet, but I don't think you will. And now we're gonna spray the top portion and place the other half of the bushing in. So mine went in pretty easily here. Now on the second bushing, I had a little problem trying to get it to seat correctly on the top part, so I'm gonna show you a little trick. So I just kind of knocked this center portion down, and then I went ahead and seated the top piece, and that was the part I was having trouble seating. And now from underneath, I'm gonna tap this center metal piece up through the top part of the bushing, and that's all it took. Now I was able to get it to seat correctly. So one was easy, one wasn't quite as easy, but they're both seated now. Okay, now that we let the Permatex gasket dry for 24 hours, we can use this fill port right here, not the one on top up here, but the one below it, to fill our diff fluid. I'm using my 7590 Redline Diff fluid. We're going to need 3 quarts to get the job done. We need 2.25 quarts, remember that. And I use a little pump that I picked up from AutoZone. You can pick these pumps up from any local auto parts store. And we're just going to go ahead and place that little pump into the quart and then just start pumping our Diff fluid into this lower fill port right here. So it's pretty easy. You just grab your tube, stick it all the way in as far as you can get it to go, and just start pumping. It goes in pretty easily, no problems at all with this. And you remember, you just want to keep filling this thing until you actually get Diff fluid start to run out of this orifice right here. So once it starts to run out or starts to start dripping out every time you pump, then you know you're full. You can grab your new washer and your fill port plug and go ahead and place it back in, torque it down to 25 foot-pounds and clean up the residual oil there, and you're all set. So don't forget to tune back in later on for the second video in this series, which is a automatic to manual differential swap in your Nissan 350Z. And now you can pat yourself on the back because you got a totally refurbished differential to put in your Z. And if this video helped you out, don't forget to give me a big old fat thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And me and the crew will be back soon with another one. So don't forget, just keep on repairing.